And now to introduce our first keynote speaker. Lorien Chavez is the Development and Operations Officer for the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines and founder of Integral. She's currently based in New Mexico, and she received her bachelor's in psychology with a focus on neurology and a minor in biology. She's passionate about the research and use of sacred plant medicines as a tool for generational epigenetic healing, and she has worked to look deeper into how psychedelics may aid in the process of remapping our minds and nervous systems, and is eager to do it in a way that remains respectful and celebratory of the traditions these medicines are rooted in. Lorien also holds a certificate in psychedelic therapies and integration from VITAL. She's currently enrolled in Naropa University's Psychedelic Assisted Therapies Certification Program, and she also serves as COO of Communities. Today, Lorien will be discussing the Chacruna Institute, promoting education and critical conversations as psychedelics go mainstream. If you'd like to ask questions during this talk, please either enter them into the Q&A function or wait until the end to ask a live question. Now, without further ado, let's all give a warm welcome to Lorien.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Maya. I haven't done a tech check yet. Is my sound working okay? I'm going to assume.
Yes, it's working.
Beautiful. Thank you both.
Nice to have you.
I am feeling really grateful to be here, very excited to be here with you today to talk about some things that are very important to me, and it's a very special moment for me that we get to share together, and I'm very grateful that you all are here. I am currently calling in from Miami Territory in Ohio, where I was raised, but actually I do currently live in New Mexico on Isleta land and have much love in my heart for both states. As they already explained, I am currently standing as the Development and Operations Officer for the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines. I'm very honored to be able to say that, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time today highlighting just a few of the issues that we believe to be critical when talking about psychedelics, if we consider to talk about it in a holistically, globally thoughtful manner. I believe it's an essential part to do so if we care to do thoughtful development and sustainable expansion, considering the rapid intensity that we're seeing when it comes to the globalization and commodification of plant medicine within the ceremonial practice. And starting to bring voices up from the global south into medical models can be quite tricky. And so I am coming at you with no expertise, but I'm excited to implant this conversation and am very honored to be present as the keynote. I also feel that it will be of great advantage to you to become aware, if you're not already, of some of the ethical considerations attached to these conversations, so that as this conference continues to unfold and my incredible peers step up to share their work and passions with you all, you have some contextualization for just a few of the social and historical contributions that make this work so fascinatingly complicated. So I'm going to spend, I believe, please correct me if I'm wrong, Maya and Erin, about an hour or so just yapping about things that I find most pertinent. But to be quite honest, lecturing is not really my favorite modality for these types of conversations, so I care to leave around 30 minutes at least at the end for more collaborative discussion and Q&A if allowed. And so please make sure to partake in that so that we can have more of a community-centered conversation. If I am able, I'm going to quickly share my screen. And let's see how that works. Thank you for your patience. All right, can everyone see that?
Yes, I can see it. Yes.
Beautiful, thank you. Actually, let's instead do this. All right. So I don't care to spend too much time here, but just for a quick contextualization for why I'm here and what brought me to this work and what lenses I am coming into this conversation with. I grew up inside of non-medicinal ceremonial spaces, or rather ceremonial spaces that were not inherently tied to psychoactive plant medicines. Most, if not all of these containers were held by women or femme-identifying folks, mostly tied to moon cycles, traditional herbalism practices, and various embodiment practices. So this, in many ways, prepared me for some of the more traditional plant medicine ceremonies that I sit in today, and instilled me with an inherent respect and reverence for all plant teachers and the stewards that have protected and passed down these traditions for millennia. You will hear me reiterate quite a bit that I believe all plant medicine teachers deserve reverence and respect, not just these master plants that we call psychedelics. The community that I grew up in allowed and normalized a lot of access to these psychedelics at a fairly early age. Of course, it depends on what culture you're comparing it to. Some people start drinking ayahuasca when they are still in the womb. That does not pertain to me. And so, again, it really depends on the culture that you're comparing my story to. But in comparison to most Western norms, I got started super early. And of course, back then, I did not have a very sacred or purposeful relationship to these substances. However, I believe that Spirit had a plan, as she does, and so far it's panning out pretty well. And I am happy to share that I've been able to really develop my relationship to these plant medicines. And when I say plant medicines, I am referring to psychedelics. And of course, there's a differentiation between plants and fungi, but for the purpose of this talk, I will recycle those terms pretty synonymously. But essentially, both of my parents, who were psychologists and academics in their own rights, did a good job of exposing me to a lot of these important concepts of development and epigenetic trauma at a very early age. And so it was able to be pretty deeply implanted in me as common sense, which I'm grateful for. And the merger of these interests really led me to study neuropsychology and biology in my undergrad. And at the time, I had the intention of moving into the psychedelic research sector of this work so that I might look deeper into how collective and individual trauma is inherited and manifested to have some somatic and social phenomenon. So especially when we're talking about certain cohorts that have shared trauma, such as Black communities within the United States, or queer communities within the United States, or Indigenous communities in general, it's very important to understand the contextualization of these historical traumas and how that might be showing up in a very real scientific epigenetic manifestation. So initially, I did plan to come into this work in a much more clinical way. However, again, Spirit kind of did her thing, and now I have been led to work more in the advocacy side of things and to study traditional ceremony, which I'm very grateful to have access through my work at Chacruna. Before I jump into any slides, it is important to me that I humbly acknowledge my youth and my studentship. I appreciate that that is very much the umbrella that this conference is being held under. But when it comes to these conversations, I am a student of the plants. I always will be, and any wisdom that I might share today, hopefully, belongs entirely to the plants. And I feel very lucky to be able to translate some of their messages today. And Chacruna has really been a wonderful container for my learning. Like I said, I'm very grateful and very humbled to be able to do the work that I do. I am only here to excitedly share my studentship with you all and in no way care to claim any sort of expertise. So that's very important to me as well. Ooh. Just a few of the things that I'm going to be covering today. Chacruna is a really huge hub for a lot of these complex conversations. And if you do not yet know of the deep complexities of this work, I'm sure this conference will be an influx of information that will lead you to understand just how many lenses and rabbit holes, no pun intended, there are to fall down. And unfortunately, I know that I will not be able to dip into all of them within this hour. So, of course, I encourage you to use this conversation as a starting point for you to feel out what intersections are most potent for you, and to use Chacruna as a resource to look deeper into these topics and to adjust conversations because there's a lot to explore, and it's really good to make sure that you're not coming at it from any singular lens or any singular form of research, because that just will not serve you very well. So I am going to jump into some of these topics, and like I said, I would love to spend a good amount of time on Q&A at the end. So for those of you that may not be aware of the Chacruna Institute and the work that we do, we are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we are very committed to producing many different forms of output of information to try to fill in some of these gaps in cultural competency as these conversations become more mainstream. And our network is really vast and very beautiful, and continues to grow every day. And as we are connected to many communities from the global south and across the Americas, it's really allowed us to bring historically marginalized voices to the forefront and platform these individuals who we believe deserve more of a spotlight. Like I said, I come from a scientific background and have a lot of love and respect for the scientific process and the scientific method. And I think a big gap in understanding that is important to highlight is, a lot of the time when we're focusing these conversations on social justice, racial justice, psychedelic justice, a lot of the time it feels that we're doing so out of social obligation or nicety, which is a huge disservice to those populations that we are serving. And actually, when it comes to proper scientific method, the first and sometimes the most important step is the recognition and incorporation of all of the existing data before that point. So we have a very bad habit in the West and generally in these places that are hubs of colonization, so not just America, but the places where the colonizers of America came from: Spain, Portugal, France, England, etc. Of discounting the actual scientific prowess of people from the global south and of indigenous people in general. Because their science might not look like our science, we say that it is not science. And this is scientifically untrue and very dangerous, especially as we are essentially forcing ourselves to start from scratch when it comes to this kind of research. And not only are indigenous people have their own scientific prowess in their own right, but they have been studying these plants for thousands of years in a way that is actually much more impressive than we are going about it now. Not to have it be comparative or competitive, but it is simply a fact of knowing what plant in what dosage, with what songs and what vibration, grown in what soil, will have what effects in which people, is something that we are brand new to. And so actually, if we are going to pay proper respect to the scientific method, we need to incorporate and acknowledge this data that does exist and is waiting for us to respectfully incorporate it. And I say respectfully because it is not to be extracted or patented in the way that we are seeing now. And so, like I said, our research and commentary spans many multidisciplinary topics, from policy and law to neuroscience and ecology and psychology, and much more. If anything, it's kind of a ridiculous amount. However, everything we do has a meta perspective of decolonization, re-indigenization, and overall psychedelic justice. And that's an important intersection that, regardless of what we're talking about, we try very hard to root ourselves in those concepts. So in many ways, not all, but in many ways, the impact of globalization is already settling in. There's really no stopping it at this point, and I don't mean to be nihilistic when I say that, but I am certainly not here to have the conversation of inherent goodness or badness about this matter of the globalization of ceremony or ceremonial medicines. However, we are inside a very ripe moment right now as we're sitting here, where we are able to do some harm reduction to ensure that this does not manifest as another exclusionary capitalistic poaching of indigenous wisdom for the benefit of some pharmaceutical profit margins, right? Like we already sort of witnessed and continue to witness the medicalization and decriminalization models of cannabis. Lots of problematic and very interesting things to look at there that will, I think, really help set the stage for sort of how we are going to go about this decrim and legalization movement within psychedelia. But it's an interesting one, and it's part of my hesitancy to speak with any sort of matter of factness, because things are developing as we speak. And another thing that I will touch on later, but is important for me to lead with now, is the danger of unification of Indigenous opinion. So as I'm starting to talk about these things, I really encourage you not to hear that this is Western opinion, this is colonial opinion, this is Indigenous opinion, because that has a danger within its own right of even different people within different tribes within the umbrella of indigeneity have very different perspectives on the way that this should go, if it should go at all. And it is equally as harmful to say, this is Indigenous opinion, to put one person on a stage as a token and to say that they speak for all people, whether it's indigeneity, whether it's Blackness, whether it's queerness. It is extremely dangerous and harmful, and that's why diversity of inclusion is something that we really highlight at Chacruna, because at the end of the day, it's about how to have conversation, who to include in conversation, and how to humbly move forward, because truly, I do believe that the fastest way forward is slowly. And this is a very interesting time that I don't think can really afford a learning curve with people's consciousness, and that's important to consider. And so it is incredibly important that we walk into this conversation with humility and sweetness, because it is of benefit to no one to center guilt or shame or defensiveness, because this, of course, just continues to center the self, which isn't always bad, but in this case, it would be unproductive and harmful. And we are in this together, and that cannot be forgotten. So really quickly, just throughout this presentation, I will try my best to continue to highlight some of the work that we produce at Chacruna so that you all have some tangible resources to take away, and it just doesn't feel like I'm dumping all of this information at you and saying, good luck. We have many integration tools, and I can also make myself available after today to do my best to guide you to the resources you need. I care very much to do that. But in the interest of respectful merger, when it comes to incorporating tradition into modernity, we've worked really hard to establish collaboration with various esteemed universities such as Harvard and Stanford and Berkeley and many more to help embed some of these ideologies into the currently developing research and programming that is starting to emerge. So even within the past couple of years, we've seen what many people call a renaissance in the psychedelic movement. I am putting kind of air quotes around that only because, it's a renaissance in the Western sense, but there's never really been there's no need for a resurgence because it has been happening underground in Indigenous communities for thousands of years. And of course, I will continue to harp on that point. But we have published and edited, I think, around like 30 books in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, all with the hopes of creating more accessibility around these conversations, and continually tried to produce literature as more necessity reveals itself. So I really encourage you all, especially as you listen to the other fantastic student talks over these next 3 days, to make little notes of what feels most potent for you and what maybe feels not right, what's not sitting right. And I am sure that we have literature to help guide you through that conversation. I also, of course, encourage you to explore our vast library of resources and continue to unpack what you think you know about these topics of oppression and justice and inclusion, because regardless of the identities that you hold, we all have more to unpack, we all have more to learn, and it is really important that we don't get stuck in a false narrative of arrival. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time here on this slide talking about the importance of identity acknowledgement inside of this work. This is a big part of what Chacruna does, of exploring these intersectional identities that merge with psychedelia, because I have noticed an ironic conflicting narrative arise within these conversations where there is some annoyance around identity, not in all groups, but I've experienced it enough for it to be important enough to talk about today. Because some people feel that it's petty or unnecessary to consistently highlight the pieces of yourself that are either abruptly visible or maybe more equally important, invisible. And I have quite a lot to say on this matter. I have a lot to say in general, but especially when it comes to looking at it from an epigenetic lens, which I will revisit often, because there's clear privilege and ignorance when it comes to the ability to excuse these historical contexts, right? And my driving point here is that it's to nobody's benefit to do so, regardless of how privileged you are, regardless of how comfortable it makes you. Even if it feels like it is bringing you some sort of relief to ignore the fact that these identities have power and influence. All it is doing is pushing you further into darkness. And I don't mean to make it so dark, but it is. And even the most privileged of us, if we truly are seeking healing, must acknowledge and unpack this pain to get to this juicy center of love that psychedelics show us is possible. These empathogens are really powerful and oftentimes can, like this common feeling of like ascension is so reiterated throughout people that experience these medicines, that they ascend up through all of these things, and they see the meta perspective and they come back down and they say none of it matters, because I've seen the meta perspective and none of it matters. And it's very similar to like when you are a caterpillar and you're in the garden and you're belly to the earth, and all you know is how to look left and how to look right, and that's all you can see, and that's your entire view, and you think that that's your entire world for your entire life as a caterpillar. And then you get this biological urge that you don't know how to identify, to climb a tree, to build a cocoon, and within that cocoon you absolutely dissolve into goo, in a way that I think is very relatable to these psychedelic experiences, where you're just like, I have no body, I am not real, and you just kind of descend into goo. And it is an absolutely imperative step to the development of you being able to get your wings and to fly over this garden and to see the entire garden, to be able to zoom out and see all of the things that you were not able to see as a caterpillar. And maybe the most important part is that these butterflies do not come back down and try to warn the caterpillars of what's to come. They do not try to warn them of their duality. They simply fly and get to see the full picture now. And in this concept of ascension, important that you are impermanently a butterfly, right? Like you are impermanently seeing this meta perspective of the garden, of the world, of the oppressions, of the oneness, of the greatness. And you come back down, and it's an important piece of being able to put your feet back out on the ground and say, I have seen the meta perspective. It is time to do work. It is time to do some real hard work and healing. And so that's an important thing for me to say, because really everything else is simply bypassing. And I will say more about this just in case this is a new term for any of you. So spiritual bypassing is a very common thing in this world and in this work. And it can look a lot of different ways, especially among the, what I'll say, New Age psychedelic communities. There's a very common narrative of oneness and sameness and what essentially is equality as opposed to equity. And although it might feel right to some, it completely ignores the reality that many people live through currently, and it dishonors the history that lives within each one of our bodies. And again, it's not for the greater purpose or greater benefit of anyone's healing, because there are very real impacts of the historical experiences that live within us and our society. And to erase that only puts us deeper in some sort of negligence or ability to do inherent harm without intent. And that difference between intent and impact is an important thing and could be a talk within itself. But essentially, as long as you have pure intent, that's really all that you can do. However, what happens when your intent does not align with your impact is sometimes where true character is able to come out of what your humility looks like, to be able to admit those wrongdoings and walk differently past that point. And so, point blank, we are not all the same, because we have all lived through very different life experiences, and we have not been born out of the same circumstances, just period blank. And this is not a negative thing. If anything, it is an extremely powerful notion which allows for a diversity of wisdom from various lived experiences that, if any of us cared to be sensitive to the literalness of the collective consciousness that we, kind of throw around this term because, like, we all did DMT in our high school basement, right? We all did that. Then the concept of this all one settles a little bit differently. And this brings me to this concept, not sure if I invented it, but probably not, of all the same versus all the soma. Because the soma, which many of you I'm sure already know, is the body of the neuron. Because although it's one unit, it's one thing, just like we are one thing, we are all one in some sense. It contains many, many different organelles. There's ribosomes and there's endoplasmic reticulum. And when one element within the soma is sick, the entire soma decreases in function, right? Not everything needs to be like mutilated for the entire soma to be dysfunctional, right? So in that sense, like the health of each element is essential to help run a cell's routine administration. And now if we zoom this out, and as we know, like the stars resemble neural reimaging mappings and the world is really just one big molecule. Again, this like merger of like science and spirituality becomes much more literal the more that you know about, molecular physics, and everything is so cool and magical. And, so the world is really just one big molecule. And when we consider the human population, and especially when we look at it from a connective genetic standpoint, we connect it to the psychedelic notion that it's really rooted in molecular physics. It is much more than, it's an intuitive understanding that when one human demographic is sick or marginalized or oppressed, we all are. We are all connected in that way, and we are all one in that way. But without going too far into codependence, there is no individual liberation until there is Black liberation or queer liberation or Indigenous sovereignty and healthy relationship to this planet, especially within the Western medicalized model that is starting to become patented, popularized, and inherent to the pharmaceutical privy. It's a very individualistic healing model that, especially when you look at Indigenous ceremonial contexts, like there's a certain amount of individuality that needs to be honored. And I think that's really important to say. That keeps us from that codependence. But really, the idea that we can heal while our earth is dying is something that's hilarious is not the right word, but ridiculous in the same sense. And so, again, this is just a fact, in my opinion, and you are able to develop your own, and I hope that you do. But I have this opportunity to say my piece, and that is it. Another important factor is the acknowledgement of identity. Again, always circling back to epigenetics, just because I think it's the best. But it's the understanding of unique trauma cycles and the very real implications that this has on our healing journey, because the power of psychedelics, both natural psychedelics and synthesized, a range of things might arise during a journey. And especially if you are here today as a clinician or a researcher, or an aspiring one, or generally as someone that serves medicine, I believe that it's really imperative to have a good understanding and preparedness for how this might come up during a session, during a ceremony. Even if your client is not anticipating it, or even if they are unaware that they are holding it, there's a very real possibility that certain ancestral traumas can come up to be processed in that moment. And your understanding and preparedness of the lenses and historical contexts that some people might be holding within their body will keep you from re-traumatizing new people. So especially, if you are a Black woman that has been traumatized by this world that has oppressed her, and you come in and with the best intent, with the most pure intent, say something that triggers something within them that they have experienced. It really doesn't matter at that point. These are meant to be, secure places. I'm not going to say safe spaces because there's a lot of weight that comes with that, but secure spaces for these people to do their own processing work. And this is a really important, I'm just going to insert here really quickly, that especially for people that are looking to get certified in some sort of psychedelic assisted therapy, or are looking to serve this medicine, it is incredibly important to remember that you are not the healer, that you are not meant to do anything. You are meant to create safety and comfort. And that's about it. The plant is really there to do the healing. Even among some of the indigenous people that I've had the honor to sit with, the humility is great. They very rarely, the people that I've sat with, at least, again, trying not to unify this experience too much, they are vessels for the medicine to come out and do the teaching. They have practices and tools that have been passed down to them generationally, but essentially they do not claim to be the actual one doing the healing work. Although sometimes, they can have songs or icaros that do bring about healing in a very literal way, but that's a different kind of medicine. And so to separate yourself from that ego of like, now I'm speaking from personal opinion, please recognize, but I do believe that, some of the biggest egos live inside of academia and spirituality. And now that they are merged in this field that we call psychedelic science, there's some predation to be aware of. And I'll go ahead and highlight some of the resources that Chacruna has created of, best practices guide, sexual assault awareness guidelines for ceremonial circles, especially ayahuasca circles. And these things can be, abrasive to start understanding how necessary they are. But nevertheless, it's an important recognition to have because, again, there is a big margin of error as these people are sick and hurt and seeking, with open eyes and open arms and open hearts. And it is very dangerous for people to say, here, I can heal you. I have the answers. And I encourage everyone to steer clear of becoming that person. And so, again, there are a lot of individual historical contexts and trauma cycles to acknowledge. In our book, Queering Psychedelics, which is a good read, I encourage it. We've also had 2 conferences, sorry to plug, about queering psychedelics because there is a rich history here, specifically like whether it's psychedelics being used as oppression. For those of you that aren't aware, LSD was used as a tool for increased grotesque during conversion therapy for gay people, and for much longer than you would think, and more recently than is comfortable. And so, again, without even being aware that those traumas exist within their cohort, those things might come up, especially if they're on an LSD journey. And so recognizing and being informed about the historical contexts of the clientele that might be coming forward to you is an important part of not walking into this blindly and dangerously or haphazardly. And then finally, the most realistic piece, I believe, is the access and integration expectations depending on social location. So by social location, if you don't know what that means, you can look to my little chart on the right, but this is essentially a range of identities. Some are, a little intuitive, such as your skin color, or your socioeconomic status, or the language that you speak, the fact that you were born in America, or if you speak English. These are all, we're pretty aware that they have a pretty significant social implication on the way that we're able to walk about this world. But especially, again, with the medicalization of these plant medicines, the access is going to be something really important to look at. I would hope that this is an intuitive piece, but it's not for everyone. And I say that with no intent for shame. But, as these therapies start becoming more accessible, it's important to think about who they're accessible to, right? So the people that might need it most, such as veterans on the street, or historically marginalized populations that do not have $6,000 to sit into psilocybin therapy sessions. It's important to think about how we want this to go and who we want to have access to, and like quite literally in a very tangible way what we're going to do to make sure that accessibility is implemented into this legislation. There is really not a lot of room for sloppiness or trust in the government systems to do this inherently. It will really take a very active hand from all of us, regardless of the power dynamics that we hold or the social locations that we identify with. Because also with integration, whether it's a preparation and integration setting, there's a lot of buildup around the narrative of, what a perfect trip looks like. There's like 2 weeks of dieta, there's 2 weeks of, integration or preparation services with a trained therapist that has gone through a $10,000 training thing. So of course they have to charge. And, if you have to work or raise kids or you don't have time or energy or access to those things, what do you do? And especially when it comes to the integration back into the real world, it can be quite jolting for all of us to sit in this space where we experience this oneness and we see the reality of our collective consciousness, and I am you and you are me in a very literal way. And then we step back into the world where those truths are not recognized or embodied or popularized. And it can be, pretty jolting to have these realizations and then to have to step back into the capitalistic reality of you need to go to work on Monday. And integration is a very important part of these experiences, but lifestyle, like it's not like a 2-week integration period and then it's over. It's a constant day-to-day incorporation of those lessons. Of everyone has access to meditation. Everyone has access to being able to slow down you personally, of how you show up in each and every conversation, how you show up for yourself each morning, each night, each lunchtime. And that is really true integration. Whereas, this concept, again, I don't want to speak so matter-of-factly, but I haven't really heard of it so much reiterated in Indigenous models, because their way of life is about preparation, integration, ceremony, whether it's plant medicine ceremony or not. It is about, living in a way that feels conductive to the lessons that you're learning every day, whether it's on psychoactive plant medicines or not. And so this slide is incredibly important to me. I really encourage you all to spend a little bit of time really exploring what your social locations are and how they might affect the way that you show up in your own personal practice, your professional practice, especially if you have any plans or intent of opening up some sort of psychedelic related practice. This is not a matter of arrival. You cannot unpack it enough. And because we are constantly absorbing the world around us in a very literal way, our skin is not a barrier to the world. We absorb chemicals all the time, just like we absorb information all the time that might not align with the lessons that we wish to carry with us. And so even if you feel that this is pretty basic information, I'm really glad if that's how you feel. But please know that there is no hierarchy, no arrival point. And these power dynamics can live within us the moment that we stop deconstructing them actively. All right. I almost wish that this Venn diagram had a third circle. I'm saying that like I'm not the one that made it, my bad, of relationship to self. So let's just pretend like right here at the bottom, there's a little relationship to self that overlaps with all of these as well. Because these social locations are also important in the way that they influence the way that we are hardwired to show up in relationship. So coming at it from a very like purely psychological standpoint, we understand that, the way that our parents talk to each other, the way that our parents talk to us, of course, influences the way that, if we get into a romantic partnership, the way that we show up with our friends, the relationship that we have to ourselves. And I also believe the relationship that we have to plants. And so I think that it is important to acknowledge relationship to plants and people individually at first, and then also to start to track patterns of how one influences the other. So how you show up in relationship to plant spirits and show up in relationship to Earth Mother can be interesting hints towards how we show up in relationship to ourselves and to other human beings and non-human beings. Are you abusive? Are you selective? Are you selfish? Or are you extractive? Do you only want the good parts, antagonizing the challenging or bad parts? Do you use terms like that was a bad trip or whatever, those common things are, instead of, wow, that was like a challenging one. There's a certain amount of bluntness that the plants can have. And again, I'm truly, please hear that I am not here to tell you how to be in relationship. I am not interested in that, and that is not my place. And I'm not here to problematize the way that you walk currently, but rather I'm hoping to evoke some sort of curiosity around these topics so that you're not seeing everything as inherently separate, because of course they are not, and we are not. So when it comes to our relationship with plants, and I have a couple examples here, but of course I could, continue and put hundreds of things within this circle of what I mean when it comes to relationship to plants. It is like we often within this like Western colonial ideology think of them as tools, maybe as weeds or something to be conquered or used or packaged, rather than autonomous spirits, which is what they are. And again, I am speaking from a purely scientific lens. I don't care to push any of my spiritual ideologies onto you if you do not already have these as your own. But I do care to pull forward, certain studies that does prove the autonomous intelligence of these plants. And again, when I say plants, I am also including fungi in that, although they are technically separate. And so speaking with some candor, these plants were here before us, and they are our ancestors, quite literally. They will certainly be around after us, which makes them our kin and our lineage. So centering these psychedelic conversations, not only around what these plants can do for us, but what we can do for these plants, is an important first step in giving these medicines the respect that they deserve. And again, overlapping these concepts with others, and we're going to pretend that there's the third circle of self. It's important to step in and also give ourselves the respect that we deserve. And as long as we continue to be in harmful, disrespectful relationship to plants and fungi and earth, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, we are being in disservice to ourselves, and we are disrespecting ourselves and the people that we love. And truly, decolonization is a big feat. But I also believe that it's not the ultimate end goal, because after decolonization comes re-indigenization. And so you can see that I have indigeneity sort of nestled at the intersection of these two things. And again, we're going to pretend that there's a third. Because without unifying the way that Indigenous people have walked through this earth, these two topics tend to be pretty merged, and the more that you work with these concepts, the more that the veil sort of thins, and the way that you treat plant spirits is very blatantly related to the way that you treat people and yourself, and vice versa. And so there's also, a lot to be said about the different ways that you can relate to plant medicines, whether it's dietas or acknowledging, again, sacredness in all plants. Do you know what's in your spice cabinet? Do you have a relationship to the oregano that you're putting in your food? Do you know about the local ecology that absolutely influences the allergies that you have and the medicines you have access to? Are you aware of like the autonomy and validity of these spirits that are influencing you, whether you want to acknowledge it or not? And essentially, there's other things that I could say about, the empowerment of indigeneity and Indigenous people to better understand our own relationship to our indigeneity. There's a lot of talk about appreciation versus appropriation. I don't feel that it's best for me to spend too much time talking about this here. However, a lot of people, as they're stepping into this work, we see a lot of appropriation of Indigenous culture from the global South specifically. And there's a lot of harm that can come from poaching those things, but not only harm to the people that you're poaching it from, like a lot of harm to self. There are Indigenous people to Scotland, there are Indigenous people to Ireland. Everyone has their own inherency of indigeneity. And so, especially if you're looking to do any work with with unpacking your relationship to your ancestors, or to unpack the history that you come from, white people in a lot of sense have some of the most important work to do, because of the wiping clean of our relationship to even know where that whiteness came from. And so, there's all of these different sectors, and then there's like white, and to reclaim that indigeneity within yourself of, if you have Icelandic blood, there's rich indigenous culture there. It's more for your benefit than anyone else's. And so to leave, to pay respect, to have admiration and awe and wonder at the various types of indigeneity that's represented, but also to have some respect for yourself and your ancestors, to explore what that looks like for you, is an important piece. And that's what I'll say about that. So looking at the national parks system, and I could pull up a couple other examples for tangible evidence here. Indigenous people, I believe the numbers are currently comprise only 6.2 of the world's population, and yet they safeguard 80% of the planet's biodiversity. These are real numbers that are a bit jarring, but unfortunately not surprising. And so at this moment, when we're talking about this massive global shift towards ecological disaster that we're living through, I am constantly hearing sort of nihilistic narratives, such as the world would be so much better off without humans. If we just died off, the world would be in better shape. And very similar concepts that sort of directly contradict this indigenous ideology that has been proven time and time again, that, we are a part of nature. We are not separate from nature. This is a very difficult thing for some people to grapple with, but that there are ways to live in harmony, so that we are actually allowing for the flourishment and connection that we wish to see in the world, and the empowerment and direct enabling of Indigenous people to live within their own right and practice is an important part of, again, all of our survival. And this is a difficult thing. You see that I have, saviorship and centering the self under the people list. And this is something that I'm still totally unpacking within myself. Again, I'm coming to you as a really humble student that is in the process of dismantling many of the things that I have absorbed throughout my life. And so, a lot of the time when you get so fired up about these concepts, everyone wants to be the one, everyone wants to be the savior, everyone wants to, even if it's coming from the most pure place, you want to do the work. And so much of what this work needs is the direct empowerment of Indigenous people to do what they do, to do what they have been asking to do on the platform that they deserve. And to, there are definitely ways that we can step in and do the work, especially when it comes to educating ourselves, not putting the labor on BIPOC people to educate us on what their harms are. However, it takes a constant ebb and flow of knowing when to show up and when to shut up. And that is something that I am still practicing, that I think will be a constant practice. And really the only way that you can walk through that with grace is to walk through it with humility, to keep your eyes, heart, brain, ears open. Gosh, I could say so much more about this. I'm going to save us some time. And so finally, this very easily leads me into the topic of reciprocity, which is a word that I'm starting to hear more and more of, which is wonderful. I am not complaining. But of course, when words and topics such as these become popularized, especially within our modern culture, there's some desensitization to the actual root of that word. And I think it's important to come back to the actual meaning to prevent such important concepts from being converted into a buzzword, because pretty much everything has the same path within this culture of, it becomes popularized, it becomes diluted, and exported and commodified, and people are, throwing it around as really a way to ultimately make money, which is interesting. Personal opinion, sorry. But, here at Chacruna, I'll use that as a tangible example, just because it's the container that I live in. We actually have developed our own Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative, and so it feels right to talk about it through that lens. We call it IRI, IRI. to try to decolonize the way that philanthropy functions within this space. Erie invites a deeper consideration of what we might mean by the idea of reciprocity and how we might embody that understanding in the most authentic way. So contributing to how we might like as a general culture and awareness around reciprocity in the psychedelic community, it's often vaguely defined and can easily slip into like this paid lip service by corporate interests or used to launder the dubious promises of neoliberal development and access to the benefit sharing. And reciprocity is an indigenous concept that doesn't neatly fit within the model of capitalistic exploitation, extracting profits from indigenous cultures that we're starting to see now. Even within indigenous modalities of reciprocity, a lot of the time we think of it as within our work, like we sit with the medicine, we get all of the enlightenment, we're like, wow, I'm so healed and I'm so cool now. And then if you're really, really nice, if you're a really, really good person, you give something back to show your gratitude and to show your thanks and to show your inherent goodness. Whereas, true reciprocity, embodied reciprocity, indigenous reciprocity, you plant the seed first. You plant the seed, you nourish the plant, you watch it grow, you sing to it, you grow this relationship with the plant. And then if you are lucky enough, if you nourish it enough, if you sing to it enough, then you can harvest. Then you can take the plant and then you put it back in the earth. Reciprocity starts with giving, not with taking. And so deconstructing the idea that we show up in a reciprocal relationship, again, to plants and people and self, is a really interesting way of starting this conversation to I think, be a little bit more productive towards the global healing that we're looking for. Again, intent is great and it's powerful and is something to be honored and appreciated. But looking at the way that you are realistically impacting these Indigenous communities and these other marginalized voices that have been fighting for the right to access their sacred sacraments for thousands of years. We have developed treaties with Indigenous communities that have not been honored. We are, in some ways, even the performative activism that we're seeing now, to where some people consider it to be fine to include, one or two Indigenous people in their talks or in their conferences or on the advisory panels for these legislative conversations. Is simply not adequate to the amount of harm that has been done to those communities and the amount of discrimination that we're seeing. And so, again, bringing it back to that soma, that we are not all the same, we are all the soma. Like we truly cannot aim to do this huge collective healing work that we hope to see with the widespread mainstreaming of these psychedelic medicines. It is more so to be considered of, how do we empower Indigenous people for our own benefit, like not in a traditionally selfish way, but the most wounded of us need to be healed for us to have access to any real self-healing. And on that note, I just want to highlight, the ideology that reciprocity is not just about giving back. It is a embodied practice that, again, takes education, takes a reallocation of your resources, a redistribution of the resources that we see now. And, land back is one of the most important things that we can do at this time. Freedom of people that are experiencing genocide at this exact moment is one of the most potent things that we can do to make sure that we are moving in a direction that is not going to push us further into self-oppression. None of us are safe unless all of us are safe. And so reconstructing the systems that exist now for the modalities of oppression that we are all harmed by is reciprocity embodied. And so I really encourage you all to look at, on this meta scale, what can you do? And sometimes that can be overwhelming. And so I encourage you to start with, personal practice of how you're showing up in reciprocity for yourself every day. If you're going to take mushrooms, who's growing it, where is it from, who spoke to it. If you're looking to experience ayahuasca, do a lot of research on the, ayahuasca tourism that is harming a lot of the communities in the global South. If you wish to do mescaline, please look at the peyote crisis of things that are not being safeguarded and protected from the capitalistic regime that is bound to reign if we let it. And again, am not an expert on this topic. There's many different ways to embed reciprocity into your personal and professional practice, and I'm sure someone else would have a completely different list than I do. But for me, what I found really helpful, which I will share, is, committing percentages of your profit to the people that occupied this land before you. So if you are doing psychedelic practices or you are making a profit doing psychedelic practices on a certain kind of land, to know who actually owns that land or who occupies that land and making some sort of contribution towards their well-being is something that, again, I think will speak into the medicine, because these are autonomous spirits and they're very aware of what's happening. The way that you speak to your medicine and the way that you speak to people around your medicine and what you do before and after ceremony all contributes to the healing potential that you have access to. So if you're looking for the most potent healing you can get, social justice and advocacy before, after, and during those sessions are going to be, I think, your quickest way to get there. And finally, I know that this has been a lot. And again, I don't love just all I see right now is my screen. I don't even see people. And so it's a very interesting way to do conversations like these. I really encourage you, if this feels particularly potent at this moment or inspiring or even overwhelming, to slow down. There's a lifetime of learning ahead of you. And at Chacruna and Chacruna Latino America, which is our South American branch, we have a lot of resources to help slow down and give language to some of these topics. Like I said, sometimes it feels like too much. You go to our website and we have hundreds and hundreds of free articles, dozens of books spanning many multidisciplinary topics. These articles, like I said, are free and accessible, and is really our way of making sure that this knowledge is as tangible as possible for the people that need it, spanning a lot of different topics, from ecology to psychology to neuroscience to important updates and commentary on the current legalization and bills that are up, whether it be Prop 22 from 2 years ago or the current legislation that is moving through now. It's important to stay informed so that you can have an opinion and that your opinion is not handed to you on a silver platter, tainted. We also have accessible community forums, platforming experts in the psychedelic ecosystem. And I put quotes around there only because, it's not just the psychedelic ecosystem, it's everything that breeds into that platform that is important to highlight as well. We have courses and trainings for professionals and enthusiasts that are really rich, honestly. Like, we have such an amazing network of academics and Indigenous representatives that are able to come in and use this platform to teach their lifelong works. We also have annual conferences, platforming sideline conversations and perspectives. I think I already mentioned our two Queering Psychedelic conferences. This last April, we had our first iteration of our Psychedelic Culture Conference, and that will be our reigning reiterated topic for the next foreseeable future. And I want to, go ahead and plug our membership, just because that's the cheapest way to get all of this for free. There's also ways to connect with other people within this community and to really make sure that you have what I like to call an accountability council as you move through this work. And that is really good timing. All right. I'm gonna go ahead and move back here. Stop sharing my screen and eagerly await any questions or comments that there may be. Erin, Maya, I don't know if you care to facilitate or moderate that conversation at all, but again, I feel very grateful for being here, and thank you very much for the space.
Yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. And I'm so glad that that was our first talk of the whole conference to kick everything off, because this is
Hi.
such a really important backdrop against which all of the, forthcoming talks will be laid against. You brought up really a lot of important things that we all need to be thinking about when working in this space that, too often don't really go mentioned. So I'm so glad that you were able to be with us today and bring all those important ideas.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
So I did have actually a question myself. So you did mention some really wonderful advice for therapists working in this space to help them in their practice, avoiding thinking about themselves as a healer and things like that. A lot of people, including myself, are involved in more like the research and scientific space. So I was wondering if you had any advice for people working in more of that realm, to make sure that we're respecting the indigenous history of these substances. And we also had kind of a similar question, that how do you think indigenous knowledge can inform practices of psychedelic science, and especially as the community moves further from the natural in favor of more synthetic compounds?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'm gonna maybe break it up into like 3 different answers. Sorry to overcomplicate. But essentially, like when it comes to the research modality, I want to revisit the idea of like, what is good science? Good science is inclusive science, point blank, period. We already have a lot of historical evidence that, there's been a lot of exclusion when it comes to Black and brown bodies in the scientific modality. And there's a lot of rewriting of the current science that needs to be done because certain people were not included in the research studies. Even when it comes to like certain dentistry, there's like a way that your gums can look in science that then people are told to like pull your teeth if it looks like that. Well, then Black people actually just have different colored gums, and they were excluded from that, and there's danger there. So especially when it comes to not only respecting indigeneity, but creating safety and ethicality around these practices, which I know is a big concern even within the FDA, and is a big part of why the advisory board shot that down just a couple of weeks ago, which I hope people are not discouraged. That was just the advisory board for the FDA. Another vote will come out in August, but a lot of it has to do with ethicality, and the only way to ensure like ethical incorporation is to have informed and holistic consideration. And so I would say, first and foremost, like within the research modalities, including there's always an advisory board on those like bigger research studies, including indigenous scientists, as they do exist, to sit on those advisory boards to look at how can we go about this in an ethical way. A lot of it just has to do with asking the right questions and not assuming those answers. But of course, I do think that like diversity of inclusion needs to be first and foremost when talking about how to create safeguarded research methods. And otherwise, I think that tangible reciprocity within these research studies, a lot of these have a large profit margin once the research is ready to be sold, or it's ready to be like constituted in some sort of tangible like exported product of whatever they are researching. A lot of people, have a hard time talking about money, especially in my position as development and operations. I have an interesting relationship with money. And a lot of the time, the answer is to the redistribution of those resources that you gain from these studies. And so for a lot of people, whether it's like bonuses or, they make millions of dollars, what percentage of that is going back to the indigenous communities that have set the stage for this research that you would not have access to if it weren't for all of the work that was done before you got there. So in the one hand, there's, social ways, like whether it's the inclusion piece, and then it's always important to come back to the tangible, like indigenous people need land, indigenous people need money. There's a certain amount of reality that's tied to that, ayahuasqueras are able to serve ayahuasca, but they can't afford their own, or they can't afford toilet paper. And so making sure that you are putting real value on that dollar, instead of, doing that spiritual bypassing that I was talking about, saying, what is money? Like, who needs money? And like, a lot of people do. And at this point in time, it's a matter of survival.
Yeah, totally. That really makes sense. We had another question in the chat that is related from Dre. So what do you envision for the future of psychedelic research and its integration into mainstream medicine?
Good question. My vision in an ideology sense, like an ideal sense, or like what do I see it moving towards? Because if we don't have a lot of activists moving forward into these roles and speaking up and making sure that each sector of these intersectional psychedelic considerations are all kind of proofed. And again, it's not an arrival point, it's a constant deconstruction. I do see this becoming like the new pharma, which I don't love to say, and I don't mean to, do it in a scare tactic sort of way, but there's a very real path that I think that we are on where, we see the poaching of these medicines in a way that is not sustainable for regrowth. There needs to be replanting mechanisms in place for pretty much every harvesting that we have. Already we're seeing a lot of the synthetic models come to light. And my opinion on that is actually still developing, especially if we're going to, globalize and popularize this work on such a large scale. To rely solely on the ecology piece, or to rely on natural ecology and harvesting, can be dangerous, but also I see a lot of lack of access for the people that need this medicine the most. And so, but on the positive side of things, I do see it moving towards more of a destigmatization and normalization for the people that have already been using these drugs. I would love to see it, feed into the industrial prison system to ensure that people that have been wrongfully imprisoned for their relationship to these medicines, a lot of the time we think that even under the Religious Freedom Act, that even the people that are doing the medicines now, those are still rated and people are still being put in prison right now as we continue to profit off of the industrialization of these medicines. And so if I'm thinking in a very positive way, I see this as a beautiful step in the direction of normalizing different classes of consciousness, allowing people to move with more autonomy, that you don't need to be part of a sacrament church. You don't need to go to the global south and poach ayahuasca from there, that there's different access allowed for different people, and that everyone can have some sort of autonomous say in the way that they want their consciousness to develop, regardless of any neurological implications or social implications that people might think. It's a freedom, right? To be able to use Earth the way that you want. And so I see us moving more in a direction of that. I just think that it's going to be a curvy road, and we'll get there eventually.
Yeah, for sure. Moving out of the scientific realm, here's another question from the chat from an anonymous attendee. What are some successful initiatives that you've seen or feel have helped contribute the most to the reciprocity between communities? And what are some models that are lacking? And do you have any suggestions on how to improve those means of reciprocity that are lacking?
Absolutely. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and plug our Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative, not only because it's, I favor it quite a bit, but because I do think that it's genuinely one of the best models for how to be in right relationship. We, I believe at this time, have over 22 partnerships with different organizations across the Americas where, we are mostly focusing on land autonomy, food autonomy, and water access. And when I say decolonizing philanthropy, this isn't a term that I came up with. So this program was founded by Joseph Mays and Bia Labache, who now the acting director is Osiris, who is a Indigenous Mazatec man. And it was really a way of trying to deconstruct this idea that, the onus is on the Indigenous people to prove themselves of why they need this money, what are they going to do with it, give us some sort of deck and pitch yourself, and again, if you're good enough or if you qualify, then we will give you money. Where again, I don't believe that represents true reciprocity. Instead, these our stewards of the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative have worked really hard on building actual relationship and being in real relationship with these communities, so that there's a basis of trust there. And then we get to send them the money, and they know their land, they know their elders, they know their community, they know their children, and they're able to use that money autonomously. And I'm going to just use that word over and over again because it is not in our position or in our right, to pass along resources and then to tell them how we would like them to use them. And so I am confident that other initiatives exist within this space that have similar ideologies. I just encourage everyone to do their research. And even if you are feeling inclined to develop some sort of your own initiative, or to, whether it's large or small scale, that relationship is at the basis of all of these, that, like making sure that you know a language, making sure that there's communication and trust. A lot of the trust needs to be earned back, whether, you personally did any harm or not. You hold identities of people that have historically hurt those communities, and they are right, to be hesitant and selective with that trust. And so Erie has done a really good job of, creating really loving relationships with these communities, so that we can give them almost 100% of the profits, just absolutely unattached, no strings, and that is a good place to start in building that trust.
For sure, yeah. Now, it looks like we only have time for just one more question. Unfortunately, there's a couple more in the chat that we won't be able to get to, so I apologize for those people. But this final question is from Esteban. He says, for a lot of Indigenous people, the term psychedelic renaissance is a loaded term with baggage. Do you recommend a different term?
Ooh, am I going to try to coin a different term? I'm sure that there's someone much more qualified than me that has come up with this term. Because I would say, like I said in my talk, I agree that the, term Renaissance, we often put in quotation marks in the literature that we publish, because in many ways it's a resurgence within the West, but there's really never been a dampening of our relationship with plant medicines globally. I would say, the globalization of plant medicines is a good term to move forward with, because that's really what it is. But yeah, I think globalization of plant medicines, globalization of psychedelics, is a little bit more accurate, because Renaissance of what? It never went anywhere. It is only coming to light now and becoming popularized in a way that is considered by many to be problematic and harmful. So I agree. I think, globalization is a more accurate term because it holds its own weight in the positive and negative sides of globalization of any concept.
All right, I love it. Thank you so much, Lorien. Thank you to everyone who participated in the Q&A. And if y'all are interested in continuing this conversation, please look up the Chacruna Institute. They're doing really a lot of great work in this space. So thank you so much, Lorien. What a wonderful way to kick off our conference. And we look forward to keeping in touch with you.
Thank you so much. It was a real honor. Thank you, everyone who's here.